Hey everybody, this is Carlos Eni, also known as insaneintherainmusic. Today, I'd like to talk about looping in video game music, in particular, how we make looping video game music with live drums. Now, we have loops in video game music to accommodate for the infinite possibilities of player states in video game music. Unlike a movie, where your scene might be 2 minutes long and you need a 2-minute cue to fill that time, in video game music, the player could just sit on the screen for a long time and we would need music to infinitely accompany the player. To do this, one of the most common things that we do as video game composers is make music that loops. Now, when we're making looping video game music, we have to make sure that the music loops both compositionally and technically. Compositionally, this means the music needs to be composed in a way to where it sounds natural for it to loop. I think this is pretty intuitive for most of us, especially jazz musicians who might be used to, looping the same form of a jazz standard over and over again at a jam session. It's also very similar to the world of musical theater, where you might have to loop a vamp underneath when somebody is speaking to give them more time. On the technical side, though, this gets a bit more tricky. We have to make sure that the loop sounds seamless, because if the listener hears where the loop point is, that really ruins the experience. And not only as a composer does that make me feel bad, that, man, I spent all this time working on this song and the loop doesn't work right, but I also think it detracts from the listener's experience, because if they can hear the point where the loop is done, it pulls them out of the immersion that we so want with video game music. Now, why are we specifically talking about drums today? Well, in my video game music composition workflow, I use a lot of live instruments. I am fortunate enough to have a large collection of instruments here that I can play, and whenever possible and whenever it makes sense, I like to record them for the music that I write. And particularly when I started using live drums, it became really difficult for me to find a way to do it seamlessly. And I looked all over the internet to try and figure out how to do it, but I couldn't really find a good resource. So that's part of why I'm making this video, to try and help explain it in case somebody else has the same problem. Before I dive into it, I want to give a couple of shout outs to two resources that helped me figure out the solution. One is the free Celeste FMOD project that's available. If you're not aware, you can access the entire FMOD, which is a video game music middleware software that lets composers decide how their music is looped and how it changes over time. There's a free version of that project available from the Celeste dev team, which has a lot of really useful information in it. I highly recommend it, and that helped me figure this out. I also want to give a shout out to this one video on Nintendo's YouTube channel, which is a behind-the-scenes recording of one of the Octopath Traveler battle themes. I saw that video, and let me see if I can find it. I found this video from the Octopath Traveler music recording sessions, Project Octopath Traveler working title, Behind the Music Nintendo Switch. And I remember there was a scene, or at least one frame, in which the Pro Tools session of this song was shown. So I found this shot in the video where the Pro Tools session of the song is shown. I'm a huge Octopath Traveler fan. I love Yasunori Nishiki's music, so I wanted to get some behind-the-scenes information on it if I could find it. And I noticed that if you look up here at the markers, it says 2A and 2B. And I was like, okay, normally when I structure my songs, all these markers make sense, but why was there a 2A and why was there a 2B? And then it hit me that this might be part of how they make the songs loop. Now, maybe the method I figured out isn't exactly the same as this video, but regardless, I want to show you how I figured out how to do it. So really quickly, what are the challenges that we encounter when we're trying to make live drums loop in video game music? One of which is reverb tails. What reverb tail refers to is the amount of time it takes for a sound to decay. Now, if you've got something that has no reverb, it's very short. There's no reverb tail, and it's really easy to loop. If you've got a sound that is more reverby and ambient, the reverb tail can pose some issues. So I've prepared a little demo here that shows the difficulties of this. This is a 4-bar loop of a synth that has some reverb on it, and when it gets to the loop point, listen to how the lack of reverb tail makes this sound a bit strange. So that loop was very obvious, right? There was a sound of the reverb decaying, and then it suddenly cut off. So we don't want that. The reason that this happens is because the reverb tail is cut off by the loop point. One of the ways we can work around this is by cutting the reverb tail right after the loop point and bringing it back to the start of the loop. So now with the reverb tail moved, it sounds like this. Seamless. Perfect. That passes my loop check. Now, the good thing about this is that it loops now. However, if we press the play button, you hear this little reverb tail that we moved from the end of the song. This sounds kind of unnatural because there's no reason for that to actually be there in the first place. It's not like the sound that reverb tail came from actually happened. This is kind of a workaround, but it also introduces a new problem that's not as good. Now, the challenge with drums is that every single drum has a pretty significant reverb tail. When you hit a drum, the drum is meant to sustain. That's part of what gives the drum impact. When you hit a snare drum, there's the initial transient, the ka, but there's also a little bit of ringing that happens afterwards that gives the drums some sustain and some power. So, ka, ka. Now, every single drum hit, kick drum, snare, toms, hi-hat, cymbals, all of them have reverb tail by design, but that makes it difficult to loop around because we encounter this issue. Sometimes with other sound sources, you can get away with making a cut when there is no reverb tail. Maybe the instrument has a couple beats of rest or isn't playing for a while, but with drums, especially when the drums are grooving throughout the whole song, sometimes there really isn't that space, so we need to find a way to circumvent this problem. Another challenge that drums present is groove and timing imperfections. When we're looping a piece of quantized music, quantized meaning that all the things that are happening precisely on the musical grid, that means that the loop points and the actual drum performance are all in sync. And I'll show you what this means here. I've prepared this drum loop that is perfectly quantized, and it loops perfectly, as you'll see. Loops like a charm, no problem. Now, part of the reason that this works is because this is completely quantized, and this kick and snare hit that are happening on beat 1 right here are precisely on beat 1. They're not a little before, they're not a little behind. And also, this whole bar that leads back into the loop point, this is all perfectly quantized on the beat. When you're working with live drums, this won't necessarily happen, and that's good. When a real drummer plays, there's natural amounts of being behind the beat, being ahead of the beat, and that's something we want to preserve, because these little timing imperfections are part of what can make live drums sound so good. I'm not trying to say that live drums always make a piece better. However, depending on the style, depending on what you're going for, you may find that getting a live performance suits the task better than trying to sequence it. Finally, another thing that makes recording live drums difficult is improvisation and drum fills. When I'm giving a drummer a part to perform for a song, usually I'll give them a groove or a couple grooves throughout the song to play, and then there will be sections for drum fills when they're leading into a new section or emphasizing a certain specific thing. Now, drummers will naturally play different fills in different sections of the song, and even if they try and perform the exact same fill, they won't be identically the same. This can introduce some problems. Let's say if the drummer is playing a fill into the beginning of a track, and when we hit the loop point, the drummer is also playing a fill into that, but that fill might be slightly different than the one at the beginning. Now, if those two fills are slightly different, and they're right before the loop points, those are going to make the loop points sound a bit different, which introduces a problem because then we won't be able to loop cleanly between the two. So the solution to that is finding a way to loop not during the fills, but during a section of groove where they're more likely to play something that's similar. So let's dive into a track that I've composed and recorded using live drums, and I'll show you how this process works. So this track that we'll be using today is called Dramatic Revelation. I composed it for the original soundtrack for Attorney of the Arcane, and it features my friend Dom Palombi playing drums on the track. It sounds super cool, in my opinion. So here's what this sounds like. So as you can hear, it's sort of like a medium tempo funk kind of thing. We have a full live drum kit here. I did use sample replacement on the kick drum, so the real kick performance was converted to MIDI and then fed into a drum sample, so we're using a kick drum from Superior Drummer. But all the other drums are live recorded. I've already gone ahead and comped the drum part, so I've gone between the takes and picked the takes that I like the most. I've cleaned up the toms. If we skip closer to the loop point, you might see why this song could be a little bit challenging. If you look at the session here, this A marker is where the song starts, and this A2 marker is where the loop point happens. Now, 4 bars before the loop point happens, there's a drum solo. It's a groove kind of drum solo, so it's not all over the place, but it does make this challenging because the drums are very exposed, so we can't really hide behind them. So let me play that for you right now. So this is what we're working with. Now, let me show you what would happen if we tried to loop this sort of a more traditional way. So you'll see that the drum fill here starts 2 beats before A. If I set the loop point here to 2 beats before this second A, the loop point would happen, the song form will be the same, but it'll sound a bit strange. Let me show you what that sounds like. And that's no good because it just doesn't sound smooth. It's not, I could definitely hear the loop there. So that's difficult. And even if I move the loop point, so the loop point is exactly on where the loop points compositionally are, this is what it sounds like. Sounds a little better, but it's still not quite as smooth as I'd like it to be. Let me show you what this sounds like with the drums soloed. I still heard a bit of a pop there. Yeah, definitely a pop. So how do we work around this? How do we find a way to make this work? So here's where my method starts. First, I'm going to briefly hide all these other tracks so we can just focus on the drums for right now. So when I had Dom record for this track, I actually had him go a little bit past the loop point. So the take started before A, and I had him continue about 8 bars after A on the second time. So this whole section right here is one continuous take. And what he's playing here is essentially what's exactly the same as the beginning. So to preserve this drum fill and the sense of groove, we're going to move the loop point of the track a little bit past where the loop point happens compositionally. So we're going to search for a spot in this approximately 6-bar section where the drums are playing as close to possible exactly the same as what they're doing on the first time through the pass. Now we could do this simply by saying, oh, let's make a cut 2 bars after the loop point and just replace it with the drums that are 2 bars after the start of the loop point from here. In theory, that should work, right? So if we just make that copy, make sure everything lines up here. Let's see what that sounds like. Now that doesn't sound quite as good. Because of the timing variations that we mentioned earlier, this kick drum got completely cut off. This kick drum hit right here got completely cut off. So what if we try this? That sounds a little bit better. You can try doing it that way and then sort of adjusting the cut point after the fact. But the way I like to do it, just to preserve the feeling, is a little bit more involved. So I'm actually going to duplicate this entire drum track, and then I'm going to move all the drum stems, all of them, all the way over here. Now make sure that snapping is turned on in your DAW if you're going to do this. And we're going to make sure that everything lines up exactly where it was before. Great, that looks about perfect. So now if I play back these two, I'm going to hear 2 drum performances layered on top of each other. I call this matching drums by ear. The reason I'm doing it this way is because if I make my cuts based on grid lines and numbers, I risk altering the groove of the drum part, which is something I do not want to touch because I want this performance to stay exactly as is. Now, groove is fundamentally variations in time, and we can hear the variations in time just by listening to the track. So if we make our loop point selection only by listening, we'll be able to select a loop point that gets in the way of the groove as little as possible. To do this, I like listening to both drum takes and try and pick a moment when the flamming, the natural flamming between drum hits being slightly apart, when the flamming reduces. I want the 2 drum kits to sound like one, and when they sound like one, that's where I'll put the cut. So let's listen to this. So as you can hear, in the middle of this fill, definitely not there. That's a lot of flamming. That's 2 drum parts. So probably not around here, because as you can listen to the kick drums. Ooh, I'm thinking there might be a spot right around here that could be good. Ooh, this might be a good spot right here. This spot. That hi-hat hit sounds really consistent between the two. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this cut here. Now, I'm going to try and make the cut in a spot where there aren't any transients happening. For example, it looks like there's a little hi-hat hit right there. I'm going to try and cut in between the hi-hat hit so it makes a little impact. So let's give this a shot. I'm also going to press this lock button right here to lock left and right movement to make sure I'm not moving the tracks left or right because I don't want to interrupt the groove like that. So let's move these up like this, match the tracks. There we go. Okay, and kind of ignore this. We don't need this for now. Okay, let's see how this sounds now. This actually sounds pretty good to me. I can kind of hear a little tiny change in how the cymbal is ringing out. It's so specific. Sometimes if we open all this and we try and drag to the left and crossfade a little bit, let me turn on auto crossfades. If we introduce a little crossfade there, it can make it even more smooth. That sounds pretty good to me. I'm thinking there might be a better spot that sounds like perfect. Let me see if I can try and find another one. Okay, I think I found another spot that might work. Right on beat 3 right here, this spot sounds pretty consistent. Another thing I'm trying to keep in mind is I'm trying to avoid spots where there's lots of cymbals ringing out. And even the drummer hits the same cymbal, the sound of a cymbal decay can be pretty complex and varies over time. And because that decay is so long, they tend to last for a long time, and they can really throw a little wrench in getting as close to perfect a loop as we can. So let me make sure locking is turned on. Yeah, I'm going to move this one back up. Okay, now let's listen to this loop. Yeah, that sounds better. Okay, so now we can get rid of this entire extra selection of drum tracks. I'm going to unhide all the other tracks, unsolo this, and let's see how this loop sounds in context now. Can't hear at all. Perfect! So the next step for implementing this loop is going to be putting it in our middleware engine. We're going to be using FMOD for this process. Unity doesn't have a great integrated way of doing this as far as I'm aware. I have worked with a developer or two that has figured out some way to make their own engine to account for looping a track that has an intro. That's basically the same thing as what this is. When we export this track from Reaper, we want to include this extra section, this extra A, and we want to make sure that we include enough of it to where it gets past the loop cut that we made. In this case, our loop cut happens right here. Why don't we pick this spot right here? I'm going to call this loop end. I'm going to take note that this loop end marker is 4 bars after the compositional loop point ends. So I'm going to make that same distance here, make that same 4-bar selection, and call this loop start. Great. So now we just have to export this out of our DAW in this time selection, and I'll bring this over into FMOD and show you how it's done. Okay, I'm here now in FMOD. I've imported the WAV file that we've just exported from Reaper. All we have to do over here in FMOD is add a loop region. And we're just going to right-click here in Logic Tracks, add loop region. Oops. We're going to right-click up here, add loop region, and there it is. Now we just have to set where the loop points are. There's 2 ways to do this. If the song is at a fixed BPM, which it is, we could set what tempo this song is in FMOD by right-clicking and adding a tempo marker, which FMOD will intelligently keep track of the bars and beats in a song. If there are tempo changes, which may happen sometimes, then you might want to do it strictly based on just time code and where the time code is. I'm going to use the time code option for this one just because I have it handy. So here in Reaper, we're going to look where our loop start point that we marked is, and that's at 10.434. So over here in FMOD, I'm going to go over to time and type in 10.434, and that moves our playhead to right there. Then I'm going to click on the left edge of the loop region, drag it over, and make sure it lines up and turns yellow, which means it's snapping to the playhead. I'm going to go back into Reaper, find the loop endpoint, which is 144.347, which is 144.347, and then zoom out a little bit, and then grab this point, drag it right over there, and then, in theory, this should loop perfectly now. Let's audition the loop point. The feeling of getting a loop point right is just so good. Oh, that's so good. Now, if you're a game music composer, I always recommend testing your loops in FMOD and not in your DAW, because sometimes if you use the repeat function in your DAW and you just loop between two endpoints, sometimes the DAW can do weird things like doing crossfades and stuff like that. We don't want to deal with that. This is exactly how it's going to sound in the game, so we want to test it using the same conditions. So knowing this track is good to go. Perfect. Oh my goodness, it feels so good. One little thing I like to do at this point is I just like to drag it. I like to drag the start of this track and eliminate a little bit of the silence, and then drag everything to the left so the track starts at the very beginning. So if we play this from the beginning. It's awesome, and now this track will just keep looping. I hope this tutorial has been helpful. I wanted to create a solution to this live drum looping issue that could work in every possible situation. So yes, this approach might be a little overkill. You could probably get away with doing something a little less involved. But if I do this process this way, with every possible situation with looping drums in video game music, I think this is a good one. We want to try and place the cut in a section where the drums aren't doing a fill, they're not doing anything fancy. We want to put the cut in the middle of a groove because that's where things are most simple. If anybody has suggestions on how to make this process easier or how to improve the workflow, I would love to hear them. I hope this has been helpful to you, and I hope you enjoyed listening to the little bit of the song. Thanks to Diamond Henge for letting me use the music of Attorney of the Arcane in this tutorial. You can wishlist the game on Steam in the description if you're so inclined. Shout out to Dom Palombi for playing the drums on this track. I'll link his social media in the description below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon in another video.